Hi, I'm Patrick Higgins. We approach 2023 with a slowing global economy, war in Europe, an accelerating climate emergency, and changing attitudes and expectations of customers, employees, and other stakeholders. Rarely have businesses faced a more uncertain future. So over the next 4 episodes, we'll be covering everything from geopolitics and globalization to organizational transformation, leadership, culture, purpose, and what businesses and their leaders have to do to create sustainable value. I hope you enjoy the ride. Welcome, Kate. Welcome, everybody, back to episode 2 of our Fireside Chats, where today we're going to be discussing the proposition that the future is not a technology problem. So, Kate, thank you for having me back again. You said that one of the sustainable transformation competencies, is data and digital. So what should the focus be for organizations?
So data and digital, I know I've just kind of in the first episode I really dissed it and said, digital transformation didn't work, etc., etc. It doesn't mean that it's not super critical. It really, really is. The data and digital is absolutely critical for businesses for a number of reasons. And one of them is really cybersecurity. And that may sound a little bit dull, right? But never has cybersecurity been more important, because over the last 5-10 years, we've brought so many systems online. We've tried to remove friction, we've connected everything and everybody. And if you think about the geopolitical climate 10 years ago, it was kind of different than it is as we head into 2023. And that does have really, significant implications. I work with a lot of large multinational organizations. Of course, Mastercard is a great example of a big organization like that. And I think for those kind of companies and brands, cybersecurity and technology investments are becoming really, really big strategic headaches, because the reason that technology, has done so well and been so successful is that, a bit like business, it was allowed to be neutral. You adopted whatever technology was the best one. But over the last few years, as geopolitical tensions have heightened, we've seen many, many examples of companies being told that, in certain jurisdictions, you can't, move data to certain places, or you can't use certain kinds of hardware. Here in the UK, of course, there's been a lot of fuss about removing Huawei from, our 5G networks and all these kind of things. And that's only likely to accelerate. So whereas in the old days, once again, as long as you made an investment in a technology that was, really the best one for you, then that was fine. Now you've got this additional layer of difficulty and ambiguity as well, I think, for a lot of organizations, because you may look at technology and say, well, this is what we need. But you've then got to say, what could be the implications of you working with that vendor, that supplier? Is this going to be, is there an enterprise risk associated, in the longer term with adopting this technology? Because once you adopt technology and you become reliant on it, then that can be an absolutely massive headache. So data and digital is really, really important. Digital transformation hasn't gone away. It's just that digital transformation needs to be seen as part of a wider sustainable transformation.
And presumably, going back to episode 1 as well, there has to be an element of sustainability in any of those investment decisions, right?
Absolutely. And, it's very interesting. Sustainability, it doesn't just mean green. It means something that is sustainable in the longer term. And, that we are being encouraged to view an awful lot of technologies and things that we do as free. As I've got a big thing about the F word, right? Free, which I know always makes us smile. But the thing is, just the energy involved in stuff, we're going to have to start accounting for. So, if you say, well, all our employees are going to do this digitally, well, yeah, but there's still a cost to that. You may not be paying for an office, or, you may not be paying for, physical stuff that you were used to paying for and accounting for. But, from an energy perspective, digital, is very, very energy intensive. I mean, our use of digital technologies now accounts for more CO2 emissions than the entire aviation industry.
Blockchain, for example.
It's nuts. I mean, it really is. When you look at the power requirements for some of these technologies. So obviously, companies need to start taking that into account. And it's you don't have to be running data centers for this to be an issue going forward.
So these investments need to be more intelligent, more holistic, for example. They need to have an element of sustainability attached to them. But what do you think the investment priorities are for technology?
I think it's one of the things about sustainable transformation and sort of ESG, when we talk about data and digital, is we are going to need far more data. So we are collecting massive amounts of data, as a world at the moment, but so much of it is not really relevant to what we need to do. So this huge, data infrastructure that's around the data economy, as people talk about it, most of that is marketing data, most of that is targeting data, it's advertising data. And very interestingly, the IDC did some work a year or so ago, and I think it's in the next 3 or 4 years, there's going to be about 75 zettabytes of data, I think it is, that we're going to create, copy, capture, consume globally. But IDC looked at that and they said that actually new data only represents about 10% of that total. So of all this data, most of it is stuff that's being used again and again. And a lot of that is going to feed, these artificial intelligence algorithms and training. But it's a really important point, because the 10% that's new, right, that is probably super useful. And we need to change that ratio around. Yeah. We need to be saying, how do we capture new relevant data? Because if you really want, to create shared value, if you really want to create value in different ways, then you need to be able to demonstrate that value. And that means different kinds of data, different kinds of information that companies don't have data supply, chains, in place to do right now. So I think there's an absolutely massive opportunity here for, in data and digital, not just to be talking about, well, digitalization is about, reducing intermediaries, driving down costs, creating efficiencies. No, it's actually about creating value. It's a subtle but a really important shift from the digital transformation attitudes, that we've had up until now.
So there's this increasing reliance on data, and data is becoming ever more important, as is the tech that we need to support it, right? What about tech debt? Tech debt is something you've spoken about before, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that this is, obviously I work with a lot of technology companies, and, the purpose of any business is to try and sell more of its product. But the problem is for technology companies that an awful lot of people, have adopted technology. It hasn't really worked in the way that they need it to. And particularly when it comes to data, I've worked with banks that have got, repositories of data all over the place that's costing them millions, to actually maintain, and how much value they're getting from it. So this tech debt idea, you get into a point where people are saying, the technology that we've adopted is costing us a huge amount to maintain. We're not entirely sure, what value where we're going to get value from it in the future. Can we really afford to invest in anything else? And this is turning into a really big problem for technology companies, because it is quite legitimate for one of the customers to turn around and say, well, we've just implemented this and we're still trying to get it to really work. And if you come in and say, well, there's something new you can use, wow, you just end up in this constant cycle of trying to implement new technology. And this comes back to my point I made in episode 1, which is an awful lot of the time they're adopting this technology in order to try and solve a cultural problem that the technology is never actually going to address. So tech debt, is a growing problem. And I think from what I see, a lot of organizations are sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, what do we really, really need to invest in? And what can we slim down? Where can we say, this is not something we should digitalize? Or more importantly, how do we take the human at the center of it and say, how do we change this process? Not just how do we take this process and digitalize it, right? Because there's a difference there.
So talking about the human at the middle of this, let's flip that and talk about AI and how AI fails, and in what regard AI fails.
Yeah, well, so much, interesting stuff about applications of AI. And some of it is incredibly powerful. GPT, 3 stuff, there's amazing stuff there. But generally speaking, artificial intelligence has very, very narrow use cases at the moment in organizations. And there was some interesting work done that found that only about 10 to 15% of companies that introduced AI could really genuinely demonstrate a strong ROI on it. And what was fascinating was that those companies were the ones who had actually done a lot of cultural preparation within the business. So that they knew exactly why and where, and they prepared the workforce, and everyone was, believed that this was the right thing to do, not just, a top-down, here we are, we'll stick some artificial intelligence in there. So that I thought was really very interesting. But the point about AI is that AI uses the past to predict the future. It is only as good as the data sets it's been trained on. And that's why during the pandemic, an awful lot of artificial intelligence algorithms just fell over. I mean, the airline industry was a great example. They just had to switch them off because it couldn't work, because all it had was data from pre-pandemic. And you can't use that to predict in an uncertain situation. So in very certain narrow use cases, AI can be incredibly useful. But the world and most organizations are not narrow use cases. They're incredibly complex and emergent organizations. And in uncertain conditions, the priority isn't to predict, the priority is to adapt. And that is a very human skill and a human trait. And that's why we've got to be very, very careful with assuming that artificial intelligence, where we implement it, how we implement it, because it's only as good as the data it's been trained on. And, those data sets can be very opaque.
And you've brought it back nicely around again to human.
I'm good at this, aren't I? Yeah,
Very
maybe
good.
I should do this
Maybe
for a
you've done it
living.
before.
Yeah.
Maybe you've done it before. You talked about the human actions, right? And I just want to read a paragraph to you, if I may. The average knowledge worker is only productive for 2 to 3 hours per day. Every week, they spend half a day duplicating work they did the week before. They check their email 36 times per hour. They're interrupted 56 times per day and waste 36 hours in unnecessary meetings a month.
It's astonishing, isn't it? It's absolutely astonishing. And if I remember rightly, I think that comes from, is it the World Health Organization or someone like that? I can't actually remember.
McKinsey, I think. McKinsey.
It was an absolutely astonishing set of statistics. But honestly, anyone watching this, sit back and think about that, and it's true.
Yes.
Yeah, you know that's absolutely true. And another thing that was mentioned recently, there was another survey that was done. It might have been HBR, I can't remember. But they were talking about how much time is wasted in switching between applications. And they came out with some astonishing stats as well, that, in order to create a task, people were switching between something like 15 different applications. And so this, when we talk about tech debt, we talk about, this is what you're finding, that this technology has been implemented without really understanding, the impact, the holistic impact on processes and on people. And the assumption that, because you've got a program that means you don't have to input something twice, that's suddenly going to make you more productive. Well, not if it means that you've got to switch between now 2 or 3 applications.
Brings us nicely around again as well to the idea of data. You've talked about data a lot. You say we're going to need more data and more different kinds of data for sustainable transformation. What data are you talking about?
If you look, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk more about, sort of ESG and that kind of stuff, but if you look at scope 1, 2, 3, and for anyone who doesn't really, is au fait with all these terms, this is when you're reporting, your impacts, your externalities, because ultimately what ESG does is it says, you as a business have got to start reporting your externalities, the impacts that you make on the, on the world around you in order to create your profit. And once you look at scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, you're suddenly saying we have to take into account, our downstream emissions or upstream emissions. So what you're saying is, if I create a pair of trainers and then I, sell it to someone, I'm actually going to be ultimately responsible for what happens to all the materials.
We're into the circular economy here, right?
We're into circular economy, and this is why it's so important, because where I believe the future for business lies is at this nexus, if you like, of the green, the blue, and the circular economies. And to really succeed, to create products and services that are successful in those green, blue, and circular economies, you have got to have massive amounts of data, because you have got to have a radical transparency into the way your products and services are used. And nobody does that right now because, caveat emptor, right? Yeah?
Yeah, and again, so thinking about how people report that back, we've been given a bit of guidance through the World Economic Forum, the IBC, etc., through their stakeholder capitalism metrics.
Yeah,
right?
and you and I have talked about this quite a lot because when I do workshops and when I consult with businesses, I very often take the stakeholder capitalism metrics as a starting point because it's basically, for those who aren't aware of it, the World Economic Forum, International Business Council asked sort of all the big accountancy firms to come together and look at all the GRIs and all the different things and say, well, how can we bring these together into something that, everybody could, a standard everyone could report against. And so I think it's very interesting because, again, it's a window to the future because there are 21 core and 34 expanded metrics. And when you look at those metrics and you say, well, here's the 21 core, what of these could we report on? The first thing that companies tend to say is, my goodness me, we don't collect half the data. We could answer these questions. So then you start realizing the breadth of data and the depth of data that you're actually going to need to be able to report against these metrics. And then you look at the 34 expanded ones and you start going, wow. And part of those are even connected to purpose.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because the 21 core, theoretically, everybody can report on them. And the 34 expanded, are just for those companies who are mature and they're 21 and they've got more difficult reporting responsibilities to achieve.
But the thing is, even if you are at the beginning of your sort of ESG sustainable transformation journey and you look at those 21 metrics and say, blimey, well, we could maybe do some of these and we need to work to be able to deliver those. The point is that you are going to be part of a supply and a value chain, and there will be potentially a value chain owner or someone else in your ecosystem, I'm going to say, right, who is going to start needing you to report those 34 expanded metrics faster than you realize because you are part of their ecosystem. And if they've got to report that, they're going to start expecting you to be able to provide that data to them. So even if you are a comparatively small business, you are going to have to find a way to report that data up as part of your value chain in the future.
And presumably one of the keys to reporting back on these things is digitalization, right? But digitalization in the past has been used in the negative, right? So, for example, rationalization, rather than in terms of enablement.
Yeah, I think, I'm making kind of a broad statement there. I mean, obviously, digitalization has done some, incredibly positive things. It's had very positive impacts, but primarily, in a lot of industries, it's been about cost cutting. It's been, as we say, about rationalization, about creating efficiencies. And one of the things that comes out of that has come out of that, is a really dangerous concentration of dependence. It's really staggering the extent to which we've created these massive points of failure. I mean, you just need to look at, the number of businesses that run on Amazon Web Services, who run on Amazon's cloud. And, let's be clear, cloud is basically renting computers. It sounds posh, but it's basically renting computers. If that goes down, that has an absolutely massive impact on a huge number of businesses. And I think we need to have conversations, as societies, as governments, as business ecosystems, about creating resilience, true technology resilience.
And I think as we look at these stakeholder metrics and the ways that we look at reporting back and measuring these things, value chain of agility seems to be one of the key focuses for you. Right?
It is, and that's another area where digitalization and data is so important, because as I mentioned, you might have to report things through your value chain, but also how agile your value chain is depends on how connected you are to other parties, how seamlessly you can exchange that data, how easily, how transparent you can be across that value chain, which brings us right the way back to where we started, which is that eternal tension between radical transparency of data, seamless integration, and cybersecurity. And because those two things, there is just an endless tension there, and you're trying to keep that in balance. And I think this is why the geopolitical, cast is so important, because that cybersecurity element is now so fluid and can be so devastating for companies that it is it is beginning to tip the balance and say there are probably digital, data stuff that we should be doing, that we need to do as part of green, blue and circular economies, as part of, creating value and reporting, that is going to become difficult for us if we have people in our value chain that are, potentially risky from a cybersecurity point of view. And we've seen people talk about this already, and we'll probably come in and talk about this more. But ultimately, what you see is a bifurcation. We've already seen, the splinternet, this bifurcation of the internet. But that could actually happen in a much more profound way, actually splitting value chains apart. And I mean, there are all sorts of, projections about what that could cost. That could cost trillions to the global economy if we start pulling people out of our value and supply chains because, they present a risk from a cybersecurity perspective. And there we are. I guess that means we have to stop, right?
Perfect timing, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us for this second episode of the Fireside Chats. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for episode 3.